Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this bunch of loose flowers in a vase. It's a pottery ginger jar and the flowers are the beautiful flowers that my daughter got me for Mother's Day. I'm taking some liberties with the flowers and just painting them very, very loosely and enhancing and changing the colours and the shape of the flowers just to really enjoy and explore this genre of loose flower painting rather than painting anything sort of specific. As I'm still learning with flowers, I think it's just a lot of fun to experiment. I've penciled in the large masses of the flowers. In other words, just the vase and the basic areas where the flowers are, the groups of flowers, if you know what I mean. And I've completely wet my paper all over. It's very wet. And now I'm just painting in with my squirrel mop a loose, fairly dilute, but well pigmented mixture of rose madder across the paper. I'm looking to get a very loose, light, delicate, sort of blurry background for the flowers. This is gamboge hue. It's a Cotman colour and it's lovely. I'm just going to rub this into the paper, allow it to blend with the rose madder in places and leave plenty of white space too. And with the paper being wet, everything's diffusing and softening really beautifully. Just wiping around the tape just to make sure I don't get any runbacks from any pools of water that might be around the edges of the page. My paper is Milford cold pressed paper. I'm now laying it flat so that I can sprinkle on or spatter on some slightly stronger darks just into the bunch of flowers. I mean, they will still soften and diffuse, but while it's wet, I just want to get a slightly darker colour into that area. And I'm drying it flat so that gravity is not having an effect on the paint. My paper is taped to my board and most of the painting will be done with my board at about a 45-degree angle. Just spattering on a little bit more paint, allowing it to diffuse. Please excuse the bandage on my hand. I'm just suffering a bit from arthritis at the moment and the bandage is supporting the bones in my hand a bit. And I think that will do for the wet in wet background. I shall now leave it to completely dry. It's now completely dry and it's dried back nice and light, nice and delicate, and it's more or less just what I was looking for. Now what I'm going to do is mix up some more of the rose madder, and with my small Chinese calligraphy brush I'm going to start on the tulips at the top. These are the only flowers that I'm going to sort of keep in their original sort of look. The others are just going to be sort of a generic group of yellow flowers and a generic group of pinky red flowers. But these tulips have got a nice, easy, distinctive shape that I think is going to be quite easy for me to paint. So I've wet the petals and put in some pale paint, and I'm going to just drop in little bits of darker paint here and there and allow gravity and the wet environment that I've created on the petals to paint themselves for me, more or less. I'm just going to swap around between the calligraphy brush and maybe a small squirrel mop brush just to pull out a bit of the paint, maybe soften some edges. So I'm looking here for soft diffusions of colour, very much a sort of wet in wet look, and soft and hard edges. I want to keep everything as simple and as loose as I can, so this is why I'm not putting in much in the way of detail. I want to sort of suggest the flowers this time more than anything else, to try and experiment with seeing if I can get the effect of a vase full of flowers to work with the wet in wet technique. Now I'm going to drop in some gamboge into the petals as well, so that there's some of that that pink and the yellow as well. It's going to be another limited palette painting. So far just rose madder and gamboge hue. A bit later on I'll use some ultramarine blue to mix with the gamboge for my greens, and I shall use it to mix with the rose madder for a sort of purple shadow colour. So it's just the 3 colours for this painting. Just using the squirrel mop to soften back so that I've got yellow and pink in there, but still nice and loose and nice and pale, dabbing out a little bit with the tissue. I've changed back to the calligraphy brush, and now I'm going to work on the group of yellow flowers. Just small petaled flowers, so I'm just going to sort of mass them in almost the same way as I would paint in maybe the foliage for a loose tree. Just making these sort of random scribbly marks with sort of petal shapes around the edges, maybe just the suggestions of that. Making a sort of a nice joined up shape so it looks like there are quite a few little flowers there. Joining them up to the stems of the tulips as well, so that's the start of integrating the bunch of flowers and harmonizing them together. As I paint, I'm dipping into water sometimes to thin out the paint, and then dipping into thicker gamboge just to get some nice darker accents in as well. And there's some pink that will go in there too. So I'm just similar to the way that I painted the tulips, trying to vary the tones so that they don't look boring, so that when it dries there's a nice diffused, soft, gentle sort of colour mixing on the page of the yellow and the pink. Now I've just splashed some clean water over here. You can see that the splashes of water are giving me some nice little very pale blooms in the tulips, and I'm going to splash on some of the gamboge and spatter that across just for some added texture and interest. I think spattering works really nicely with flowers, especially the sort of semi-abstract ones. It can add to the texture and to the look of the whole piece. Now, this is a fairly rich mixture of the rose madder, and I'm going to paint exactly the same sort of way but slightly different, slightly more blocky, blocking this in a little bit more for the pink flowers, adding water to thin down the paint in places to produce this kind of mass of red and pink flowers over on the right. Just these little scribbling motions, holding the brush well back so I get a nice loose and free and expressive mark. I'm not bogged down, or trying not to get bogged down by painting flowers as such. What I'm trying to do is paint marks on the paper, and hopefully when those marks are seen all together, it'll give the impression of a bunch of flowers or a vase of flowers. Everything's still wet, so I can drop in darker paint here and there, just adjust things, but it is beginning to dry, so I'm needing quite a nice thick dry mixture of the paint in order for it to stay. Another flick of strongly pigmented rose madder. If I tap the brush like that, I'll get these nice big drops, and if I flick the brush, I'll get a nice sort of even spray of fine mist-like drops. Just building up that texture all around the vase, at the base and along the side. I highly recommend experimenting with painting loose flowers like this. It's so much fun. Just making a few small adjustments with the calligraphy brush, just bringing out a few dots and dashes to make the edges a little bit more ragged. You can see how I'm joining together the bunches of flowers slowly but surely, so that they're all linking together over the top of the vase. I can always sponge a little bit out of the paint out with a tissue just to soften back even more and just to bring a bit more light back into the flowers in places. There's no wrong or right way of painting flowers like this. It's all about really having fun and seeing what the paint can do for you. I've now mixed up my Gamboge yellow with ultramarine blue, and I've got various shades of a nice spring green running through to a fairly dark green. And I'm just going to pull out these long daffodil style leaves, long thin leaves from behind the bunch, just coming out at various angles. I'm going to put some green into the stems and some green detail around the base of the flowers. Just trying to suggest all the leaves. I'm doing this while the flowers are still wet, and what that means is that the green, where it meets the flowers, will softly diffuse into the flowers and give me very soft transitions there and some lovely colour blending on the page. Again, it's the way that watercolour, when you use it wet and wet, it sort of paints itself. You just have to kind of set up the conditions for it to do so. Just dotting and dashing around the base, and it gives the impression of leaves behind the flowers. Now lastly, for this stage, I'm going to paint in some what looks like little petals from the flowers that may have dropped and fallen onto the shelf around the vase. I think that could be quite a nice little effect when you're painting a vase of flowers. There will be a 3-part tutorial for this, showing just about every single brush stroke and explaining a lot more about the process on Patreon. So if you're interested in that, please follow the link below. Once I've finished painting all these in, then I shall leave it to dry and then come back to put in some of the final details. It's now completely dry, and you can see it's dried back much lighter again and is still looking quite sort of nice and delicate. So now I've mixed up my my green into a very rich blue green, and I'm going to paint the vase. I'm using my flat brush, and I've taken a very rich dry mixture, thick mixture of the paint, and using the flat brush I'm going to pull it into the shapes of my Chinese ginger jar. I want to keep it fairly dark on the left and have it getting lighter as it comes around towards the right side. I want to keep it nice and simple as well. I just want to again suggest the vase rather than paint it as a very sort of photorealistic piece. Keeping it nice and flat across the base and putting in some shadow across there as well. And adding in virtually pure ultramarine blue into the green there, and that's mixing in to give me a very dark green on that edge. And a bit of gamboge into the lighter part of the vase, just for a bit of reflected light. Next, I'm going to pull down some of the same colours below the vase to sort of give some reflected light and reflection on the sort of shiny shelf below the vase. Just wet that area with my harky brush, and now I'm pulling down the same sort of colours vertically from the base of the vase, just to give me that kind of shadow sort of reflection look that I'm wanting. I think that will do again, and now I'll just leave that to dry. Now that it's dry, I can put in some of the final details. Now this involves my small Chinese calligraphy brush again, with an even darker, richer mix of the green, made again with the ultramarine blue and the gamboge, and I'm putting in some shadows all around the leaves and on the top of the vase. So I'm sort of negatively painting with green around the flowers, around the edges, in between them as well, which makes the groups of flowers pop a lot more against the dark, and also gives the impression of the stems and the leaves as they come out of the vase, and the shadows across the vase too. This also helps to link the yellow flowers with the pink ones, and it kind of gives that shadow behind these groups of flowers where the leaves are poking out. When you get to a painting at this sort of stage, it's often a matter of half closing your eyes and sort of squinting at the painting, just to make sure that you can see enough darks, enough contrasts, and that will kind of show you more or less where you need just those little extra pops of deep colour just to bring the painting together. And this time I'm using rose madder mixed with the ultramarine blue to give me this nice purple colour, which I'm using in various either light or dark, depending on whether there's more blue or more pink in the mix. It's giving me this nice shadow colour to go into the red flowers. Again, just a bit more variety. So it's not just the green shadows, the green sort of deep green, there's this deep purple sort of areas which help to bring out the shape of the red flowers more, and some accents on the vase too. And as I often say, for the finishing touches of a painting like this, where you're painting with wet paint onto a dry painting, just take your time and just work fairly slowly, just making sure that you really know where you want your accents and your darks to go. One of the last places that I want some darks is to enhance the shape of my tulips a bit more. I'm going to use the ultramarine blue and madder mix, the purpley mix, to bring up some stronger shadows on the left side of the tulips, and I will soften them back where they're too harsh with a little bit of clean water. Just helps them to stand out a little bit more. I think they were getting a bit lost. Now you could leave it at that if you wanted to. I think the background's very soft and gentle and very light. I think it works very well against the fairly detailed and bright group of flowers. But I think I'm going to just carry on a bit more, and I've decided I'm going to put some more colour into my background once I've just finished with these little last touches on the vase. So I've mixed up some of my gamboge, and I'm going to use my large harky brush and sweep the gamboge across the shelf. Now that looks really harsh and unpleasant, I must admit. I wasn't expecting it to look quite as bright as that, but I will knock that back a bit, so no panic. I'm going to draw horizontal dry brush streaks of gamboge up across the background, because what I'm trying to do is to make it look like the flowers are sitting on a very bright windowsill with perhaps a lace curtain and the sun filtering through the lace curtain. So now I'm going to soften that gamboge with some of the rose madder. It will dry back a bit lighter as well. Just bringing some of those streaks so it looks like just some light coming in through the curtains behind the flowers. And then I'll bring out more light by lifting out some of the paint with a clean tissue. I think in hindsight I would have left it as it was, but it's an interesting experiment, and I think that if you're tempted to try something with a painting, then go for it, because after all it's only a piece of paper, and if it does work then you will have learned something new, and if it doesn't work you've also learned something new. But I think that looks okay. I'm quite pleased with the way that turned out. I like the sort of just that little extra bit of interest now to the background. So here's the finished painting with the tape removed and a nice clean white border, and I'm very pleased. As I say, I haven't done many of these flower paintings, but this one has taught me such a lot especially about the wet in wet technique, and kind of the using of a limited palette and using darks to really make the flowers pop. I only used 3 colours here, rose madder, gamboge and ultramarine blue, and yet we've got so much variety here. Thanks so much for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and click on the bell icon if you want to be notified whenever I post a new video. Thanks so much, and thanks to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon then. Bye.